The mountain loomed over us like a crouching beast, jagged and terrible, its spine wrapped in the swirling grey tendrils of morning mist. Each step up its crumbling path brought a fresh bite of the chill, seeping through the gaps in my armor and gnawing at my bones. The air smelled of wet stone and decay, with a hint of something far fouler that turned my stomach. I shivered, though not from the cold. It was the scent of death, heavy, cloying, and unmistakable. Sir Winfield marched ahead, his silhouette a dark shape against the muted sky, always leading, never faltering. His armor was scratched and dented from past battles, the once brilliant steel now dulled by age and war. Yet he wore it as if it were newly forged. His movements were sure, every step filled with the confidence of a man who had faced the horrors of battle and walked away victorious. To me, he was invincible, a living legend with a sword arm unmatched by any in the kingdom of Pirinfall. I had grown up on stories of his heroics, the way he had vanquished the Witch of Ashgrove, driven the bandit lords from the northern passes, and won a dozen tournaments in the king's name. I, Neo, was merely his squire, his shadow, his pupil, and his burden to bear. I dreamed of knighthood, of riding into battle under my own banner, but those were dreams for another day. Today my task was to follow, to watch, and to learn. The king himself had chosen us for this quest, the knight for his prowess, and I for my loyalty. The dragon that plagued our lands had burned villages to ash, devoured our livestock, and left our fields fallow. A beast of nightmares, and it was up to us to put an end to it. But as we climbed higher, I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. The wind howled around the crags, carrying faint echoes of screams. The path grew narrower, more treacherous, as if the mountain itself sought to keep us from our prey. Rocks shifted underfoot, and twice I nearly lost my footing, saved only by my desperate grip on my sword hilt. "Keep up, lad," Sir Winfield called back to me, his voice a deep rumble that cut through the whistling wind. "We've not far to go." I nodded, swallowing my fear as I quickened my pace. There was something unsettling about the way the world seemed to shrink as we ascended, the valley below swallowed by mist, the sky above obscured by thick, roiling clouds. We were alone in this place, cut off from the world, two specks of iron and flesh against the vast, uncaring mountain. Finally, we reached a ledge that jutted out over a sheer drop, and there, nestled within the mountain's maw, was the dragon's lair. It was a cavern of enormous size, the entrance framed by jagged rocks that resembled the gaping jaws of some great beast. The ground was littered with bones, some bleached white, others still stained with bits of flesh. Skulls of men and beasts alike lay scattered in the dirt, their empty eye sockets staring accusingly at us as if to warn us away. I recoiled at the sight, my breath catching in my throat. The stench of rotting meat was overpowering here, thick and cloying, and I had to cover my nose to keep from retching. This was not a lair. It was a slaughterhouse. Sir Winfield strode forward, unbothered by the grim scenery. His eyes were fixed on the dark tunnel ahead, where the faintest glimmer of orange light flickered. Firelight, the dragon's heart. He glanced back at me, his expression stern but not unkind. "Steady yourself, Neo," he said, drawing his sword. The blade caught the dim light, glinting dully as he hefted it in both hands. "This is what we came for." I nodded again, fumbling with my own weapon. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the sweat pooling under my helmet, trickling down my neck. I tried to steady my breathing, to summon the courage I had felt when we first set out from Pirinfall, but all I could think of was the bones. So many bones, each one a testament to the dragon's hunger. We stepped into the cave, the light growing stronger as we ventured deeper. The walls were blackened with soot, the floor uneven and slick with some dark, oily substance. The heat grew oppressive, like a forge set to full blast, each breath hot and dry in my lungs. and then we saw it. The dragon lay coiled in the center of the cavern, its massive body stretched across a mound of gold and jewels that glittered like stars in the firelight. Its scales were a deep mottled black, like charred iron, with streaks of sickly green that shimmered as it moved. The creature's head was as large as a cart, with eyes that glowed like molten coals and rows of teeth as long as my forearm, each one sharp enough to rend flesh from bone. Smoke curled from its nostrils, and every exhale was a low, rumbling growl that made the cavern tremble. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away from the beast. I had heard stories of dragons, seen tapestries depicting their fearsome might, but nothing could have prepared me for the real thing. It was the very essence of death, an ancient terror given form and fire. Sir Winfield, however, did not hesitate. With a roar of his own, he charged, his sword raised high. The dragon's eyes snapped open, and in an instant it reared back, its maw opening wide as it unleashed a torrent of flame. Sir Winfield dove to the side, rolling to his feet as the fire scorched the stone where he had just been standing. The heat was unbearable, a blinding wall of searing light and pain, and I could only watch in horror as the knight met the dragon head-on, their clash echoing through the cavern like thunder. The fight was brutal, a whirlwind of steel and scales, fire and fury. Sir Winfield was a master of his craft, every swing of his blade precise, every movement calculated. He struck at the dragon's neck, its belly, its wings, each blow landing with a sickening crunch. But the beast was relentless, lashing out with its claws, its tail, its fangs. It moved with a speed that defied its size, twisting and coiling around the knight, snapping and biting as it drove him back. I tried to join the fray, but every time I drew close, the dragon's tail whipped around, forcing me to retreat. I was useless, a coward hiding behind his shield, as Sir Winfield battled for his life. I wanted to help him, to prove myself worthy of his trust, but the fear rooted me in place. The dragon roared, a deafening sound that shook the cavern, and I saw Sir Winfield stagger, his armor scorched and battered. Then, in a flash of blinding light, the dragon's head snapped forward, and a torrent of fire engulfed Sir Winfield. He screamed, a terrible, agonized sound that cut through me like a blade. I watched, helpless, as the knight was thrown back, his armor glowing red-hot, smoke rising from the gaps in his visor. He fell to his knees, his sword clattering to the ground as he struggled to rise, his strength failing. "No!" I shouted, rushing forward, but it was too late. The dragon lunged, its jaws closing around Sir Winfield's torso, lifting him off the ground like a rag doll. I heard the sickening crunch of metal and bone, and then the knight was flung aside, his body crumpling against the cavern wall. Time seemed to stop. I stood there numb, staring at the still form of Sir Winfield. The knight who had never faltered, never failed. The knight who had been like a father to me. He was dead. The dragon turned its gaze on me, its eyes burning with malice. I could feel its heat, the weight of its hatred, and I knew that I was next. But something inside me snapped. Rage, fear, sorrow, all of it melded together in a blinding surge of adrenaline. I reached down and seized Sir Winfield's sword, feeling its familiar weight in my hands. It was heavier than mine, a true knight's weapon, forged for a hero, and in that moment I knew what I had to do. I charged, my scream echoing off the cavern walls. The dragon reared back, its tail lashing out, but I ducked under the swing, rolling forward until I was at its side. I drove the sword into its flank, feeling the blade bite deep into the tough, scaly hide. The beast roared, twisting in pain, but I held on, pulling myself up onto its back. The scales were slick with blood, but I climbed, using every ounce of strength I had left. The dragon thrashed, trying to shake me off, but I clung to it like a tick, my fingers finding purchase between the scales. I climbed higher until I was at the base of its neck, the sword gripped tightly in my hands. I could feel the heat of its breath, the rumble of its growl vibrating through my bones. And then with a final, desperate cry, I drove the sword down, plunging the blade deep into the dragon's skull, right between its glowing eyes. The beast let out a deafening roar, a sound of pure agony that rattled the very stones of the cave. It thrashed wildly, bucking and twisting, but the blade held firm, and I held on tighter, refusing to let go. Black blood gushed from the wound, hot and acrid, splattering my armor and burning my skin, but I didn't care. I pushed the sword deeper, feeling the resistance give way as the steel pierced through bone and brain. The dragon's movement slowed, its roars turning to choked, desperate gasps. Its massive body shuddered, then slumped, collapsing in a heap on the cavern floor. I was thrown from its back, landing hard on the pile of treasure beneath us. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs, and for a moment I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, dazed and disoriented. The only sound was the dragon's labored, rasping breath as it bled out, its life draining away with every ragged exhale. I forced myself to my feet, my entire body aching. The dragon's eyes had lost their fire, the once bright embers now dimming to a lifeless grey. It gave one final shuddering breath, and then it was still. I had done it, the beast was dead, but the victory was hollow. I turned, my gaze drawn to the broken body of Sir Winfield. His armor was blackened, warped by the dragon's flames, and his face, what little I could see of it, was twisted in pain. I knelt beside him, reaching out to touch his gauntlet. It was still warm, though I knew he was gone. "Sir, I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. I had failed him. I was supposed to be his squire, his right hand, but in the end I had been nothing more than a frightened boy, too scared to act when it mattered most. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away. There was no time for grief. I had a duty to perform. I staggered to my feet, dragging Sir Winfield's sword from the dragon's skull. The blade was slick with blood, its edge chipped and dulled, but it was still a knight's weapon, still worthy of its master. I sheathed it at my side, then turned my attention to the dragon's head. It was enormous, even severed from the body, its teeth still bared in a final snarl. I took a deep breath, summoning what little strength I had left, and began the grisly task of removing it. It was a gruesome process, the stench of the dragon's blood thick in the air as I hacked away at the sinew and bone. My arms burned with the effort, my hands raw and blistered, but I kept at it, driven by a need to finish what we had started. By the time I was done, the sky outside had darkened to a deep, bruised purple, and the first stars were beginning to peek through the clouds. I bound the dragon's head with ropes, securing it to the back of my horse. It was heavy, almost impossibly so, but I managed, fueled by a mix of exhaustion and determination. With one last look at Sir Winfield's body, I mounted up, the dragon's head trailing behind me, leaving a dark smear of blood and ash in its wake. I rode slowly, the journey down the mountain feeling twice as long as the ascent. The mist was thicker now, swirling around me like ghostly fingers, and every shadow seemed to whisper of failure and regret. I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the path, forcing myself not to look back. The ride back to Pirinful was a blur, the landscape passing in a haze of grey and green. The villagers watched in stunned silence as I rode through their charred, blackened fields, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and horror at the sight of the dragon's severed head. I could hear their hushed whispers, their gasps of disbelief, but I paid them no mind. All I could think of was the throne room and the king who awaited my return. When I finally reached the castle, I was met with a flurry of activity. Guards rushed forward, their faces pale as they took in the dragon's head, its lifeless eyes still smouldering faintly. I dismounted, my legs nearly giving out beneath me, and together we dragged the monstrous trophy up the steps, through the great hall and into the king's presence. The throne room was vast and echoing. the stone walls adorned with banners of red and gold, the colours of Pirinfall. King Aldrich sat upon his throne, his expression one of grim anticipation. He was a hard man, forged in the fires of war, with eyes as sharp as the blade at his side. He rose as we entered, his gaze falling first on the dragon's head, then on me. "Squire Neo," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command, "you have returned." I bowed my head, struggling to find the words. "Your Majesty, the dragon is dead, but—" "Sir Winfield," my voice faltered, the reality of it crashing down on me anew. He didn't make it. The king's expression darkened, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, he descended from his throne, his boots echoing against the stone floor. He approached the dragon's head, studying it with a mix of disgust and fascination. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes softening, if only slightly. "You have done what was asked of you," he said, his voice quieter now, tinged with something that might have been sorrow. "Sir Winfield was a great man, and his loss is a heavy blow. But today you have proven yourself worthy of the title you aspire to." He gestured to one of his attendants, who stepped forward with a small wooden box. The king opened it, revealing a gleaming silver medallion, an insignia of knighthood, the highest honor our kingdom could bestow. He took it in his hands, then placed it around my neck. "Rise, Sir Neo," he said, and though the words filled me with pride, they also weighed on me like a chain. "You are no longer a squire. Today you are a knight of Pirinfall." I rose, the medallion cold against my chest, and looked up at the king. I wanted to feel joy, to bask in the glory of my new title, but all I felt was the hollow ache of loss. Sir Winfield had been more than a knight. He had been my mentor, my friend, and now he was gone, taken by the very beast I had sworn to slay. As I left the throne room, dragging the dragon's head behind me, I couldn't help but feel that this victory, like so many in the stories, had come at too great a cost. The people cheered as I passed, hailing me as a hero, but their voices were distant, muffled by the weight of my grief. I was a knight now, but I was also alone, burdened with a legacy I wasn't sure I could uphold. And as the castle gates closed behind me, the dragon's head thudding heavily against the cobblestones, I realized that this was only the beginning. The tales of knights and dragons were never truly about the monsters. They were about the men who faced them, and the scars they carried long after the battles were won. I looked up at the sky, the stars bright and cold above, and swore that I would carry Sir Winfield's memory with me through every trial and every dark night. For I was no longer just Neo the squire, I was Sir Neo of Pirinfall, and the weight of the fallen would forever drive my sword.